Thanks, obviously, to Marlene. It's always a pleasure to come and speak now and again about Central Asia, and it's always remarkable how you manage to fill the room and sort of mobilize whatever interest in the region there is in town when you have these events. I'm going to talk about the New Silk Road. This morning we heard about One Belt, One Road. The New Silk Road is sort of the American version of that, as we've already heard. But I'm really, I think, going to use the New Silk Road as a kind of unifying theme to talk about a number of other things, including the question that I think a lot of people are having in the region, and for which it's not an academic question, and that is, what is going to happen to Afghanistan? How stable is it? How fragile is it? So let me begin first by saying, in my view, the New Silk Road is kind of a vision that sometimes masquerades as a policy for the U.S. I don't think it has ever reached the level that we saw this morning of One Belt, One Road being an actual strategy. So the vision obviously is this interconnected South and Central Asia region, and the crucial point here is that it has Afghanistan at the center. And as Shahbanu Tajbakh has put it, it's a political and economic hub of a conglomeration of regional countries near and distant. And part of the idea and part of why the U.S., through its position in Afghanistan, has been promoting this is because the hope is that regional trade passing through Afghanistan and regional energy flows passing through Afghanistan will actually help Afghanistan to sustain itself. I think that that's, the order is probably the wrong way around. I think we'll need more stability in Afghanistan before any of that becomes remotely possible, but that's sort of the vision. And let's also not forget that around this vision there are a number of other processes and projects and fora, including the Heart of Asia, or the Istanbul process, the Afghan-led Regional Economic Cooperation Conference on Afghanistan, and the East-West Institute has an initiative called Afghanistan Reconnected, and they all have this sort of idea of integration with Afghanistan at the center. Which is, as the promoters, and most promoters of this vision have noted, has been a feature of Afghanistan's history in the past. I would argue that it's probably more the exception than the rule, historically speaking, but there's certainly the idea that Afghanistan has played this role. And then the modern version of it, I think the last time it really played this role was in the mid-18th century, when the Durrani Empire was built on the trade of horses from Central Asia to India, which needed good horses but didn't have good pasture lands. And Afghans, sort of the first Afghan as a nation, sort of was strengthened and fueled by that. And now instead of horses, we have energy, where we have lots of resources in Central Asia and energy poor or energy deficits in South Asia. Somebody mentioned recently a statistic that Pakistan lost $4 billion last year in textile production because it didn't have sufficiently consistent energy supply. The premise behind this vision, again, is that there's sort of an Afghanistan that's stable enough and a government that's able to drive this agenda, as well as an international community that's united around the concept and also willing to drive this process. And I think recently, and in some cases very recently, in terms of the last few months, both of these premises have to be seriously reevaluated. The first concern is that the Afghan government is too weak and divided to handle the increasing threats that it's facing. When I talk about increasing threats in particular, we mean a Taliban which has not been subdued by many accounts is actually expanding. And second, the difficult and intriguing question of the emergence of ISIS in Afghanistan and what that means. And I'll talk about that for a moment. As well as these threats, we also have an Afghan government that itself is divided. There's a power sharing agreement that was put in place after the contested 2014 elections, and it is not working well by any stretch of the by anyone's account. I've been doing myself a lot of research on that. I'm not going to talk about it right now. If there are questions afterwards about how bad it is, I'll be happy to go into more detail. And then one other point to note in terms of the international consensus is a few recent moves, in particular by Russia. It's been somewhat astounding that since 2002, there's been not only international consensus on what has essentially been a U.S.-led effort in Afghanistan, but Russian tolerance of having a large NATO force in its backyard. It was never comfortable, but in all of the votes, the annual votes in the Security Council to reauthorize ISAF or NATO in Afghanistan, there was only one abstention by Russia, and if I remember correctly, it was because of a procedural problem they had. It wasn't a substantive problem. But recently, what has happened? First, these curious reports that Russia is talking directly with the Taliban outside of any process which is being sort of set up and driven by the U.S. The U.S. position, of course, is that the Afghan government should talk to the Taliban. But now we have a bit of a breaking from the usual pattern. Obviously, a renewed attention to Central Asia by Russia, which I think has already been discussed. And then third, sort of the intriguing sale of 10,000 or donation of 10,000 Kalashnikovs by the Russian government to the Afghan army. And this may not be a lot, given how many Kalashnikovs already exist in Afghanistan, but I think symbolically it's interesting. From my experience, again, working on this file for the UN for many years, Russians were very cautious about providing any sort of aid to Afghanistan, let alone military aid. And I think even one or 2 years ago, this sort of involvement would not have been would have been unthinkable. I don't think the Russians would have thought of doing it, given their legacy of military involvement in Afghanistan, and the Afghans certainly would not have dared to accept it. And then we don't need to be necessarily too curious about what's behind this if we take the words of Russian policymakers literally. Zamir Kabulov, the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan for Russia, said, "Honestly speaking, we are already tired of joining anything that Washington proposes." An advisor to the head of Russia's anti-drug agency said that cooperation in that area was also ending. The Obama administration buried this promising line of cooperation. All room for cooperation is exhausted. So I think we have the beginning of a breaking of this international consensus, either through states beginning to take their own line in Afghanistan, or through a gradual disengagement by a number of other states. And as I mentioned, one of the main things that's driving this change is fears now that Afghanistan will collapse. I was speaking to a colleague who said that he had recent meetings in Moscow who said that Russians have gone from being concerned to being afraid. And again, one of the causes of this fear is ISIS. So what is ISIS in Afghanistan? Well, my USIP has commissioned some research to try to figure this out. It's a fast-moving phenomenon. Originally, the idea was that, or the supposition, especially among people who follow Afghanistan closely, and who began from the premise that Afghanistan is not a country which is prone to huge sectarian cleavages of the kind that ISIS has been promoting elsewhere in the Middle East. But where they have emerged, which is in around Nangarhar, there has been for decades an investment of Saudi madrasas where there's maybe a bit more hospitable environment. So the question is, well, does it stay limited to Nangarhar? There's a lot of pressure on them also by the Afghan government and by U.S. air power. Or will it gradually spread and take advantage of the numerous fissures in the Afghan political environment? And one of the very preliminaries, I take this as a possible hypothesis for now, is that where they're actually beginning to move and where they're beginning to emerge follows a pattern of drug trafficking routes up towards Central Asia. And I think that probably local actors are noticing this. And as I said, the fear of what this might mean for them is not academic. It's very real. Then the other reason why ISIS is dangerous, in particular to Central Asian states, is the fact that they've begun to make alliances with Central Asian groups that used to be in Waziristan and now are in Afghanistan. What happened in 2014, this is a point of frustration, I think, for US policymakers, is that we've been asking Pakistan for years to make a move against their insurgents in the tribal areas. And they finally did, but what was the year they did it? It was a year that US troops were removed from the area. So the idea originally was, let's have a hammer and anvil action. We removed the hammer, and the Pakistanis decided that's a good time to bring in the hammer, which means a lot of these groups have moved into Afghanistan and have begun to establish themselves in the north. One of the analyses I heard was that the fall of Kunduz last September would not have happened if it weren't also for the active assistance of the IMU, which was nearby. So these movements present, I would say, a double threat to Central Asian countries. First, a general threat that they'll help the overall disintegration of Afghanistan and the scenario of anarchy that we're all worried about. And second, that they will establish sanctuaries in the north from which they can take direct specific actions against the governments of the region. Yeah, I suppose, I mean, on the drug trafficking point, one of my cynical comments is, you know, to the extent that there is a new north-south Silk Route happening or emerging, it may be a north-south Silk Route of drug trafficking run by extremist groups rather than our illicit idea of energy trades. So, that was my link that I almost lost to. Given the situation, given the fears of what might happen in Afghanistan, given everybody's realistically dire prognostication, what is the status of the formal New Silk Road that the U.S. has been proposing? There's been progress around the edges. We hear about CASA 1000, we hear about TAPI starting, but there have literally been years of meetings and publications and policy papers, and they have not really transformed the concept into a reality. And I think that one of the reasons for that is basically the structural idea that the benefits of the scheme are theoretical and distant, far away in the future, and the risks, especially the risks of cooperation among these states that don't necessarily trust each other, are imminent and real. We saw this morning in Alex Cooley's presentation the amount of resources that China's put in One Belt, One Road and the very, very paltry resources we've put behind our vision. And I think that when there's a sense of this lack of commitment and there's nothing real behind it, these states are not going to suspend their traditional ways of doing things in the hope that this is going to bring them the theoretical benefits that we've been talking and writing about for a long time. Furthermore, the projection of U.S. policy has been, for the last half-decade, a rhetoric basically of disengagement, and disengagement along certain timelines rather than objectives. So, I mean, you could almost say that from Karachi in the south to Kostanay in the north, this policy, this rhetoric of disengagement has sort of led to really a regional complex of hedging behaviors that have made the effort to try to put together something serious around the Silk Road, it basically doomed these efforts to failure. Now, another bit of research that we've commissioned is to try to look a little bit more systematically at what are Central Asian attitudes of governments in particular towards this regional cooperation. Because my sense is that from the little time I've spent there, that there are two things that American policymakers sort of consider to be axiomatically good, and that Central Asians consider to be highly distrustful. And one is democracy, and the other one is free trade. So having that impression, we commissioned somebody to go and talk and find out, well, what do they really think about this new Silk Road? First conclusion, not surprising, insecurity and stability in Afghanistan are the major obstacles to growth of trade between Central Asia and Afghanistan. I remember speaking to a Tajik government official saying, we don't mind selling stuff to Afghanistan, but there's nothing we want to import from it. All they have is drugs, arms, extremists, and terrorists. So that's not a two-way trade scenario, and I think we can understand that position. The other interesting thing is that the New Silk Road strategy is viewed as purely political and anti-Russian, and devoid of economic rationale, organizational mechanisms, and funding. And I think we need to now watch. I mean, I basically, it won't be a surprise to you. I think the policy is pretty much a dead letter right now. But it would be interesting to see how the recent and increasing tension between the U.S. and Russia will maybe make this hedging even more significant, and Central Asian countries even more or less willing to even pay lip service to this concept. Third point, a degree of resentment in Central Asia to the New Silk Road strategy and the other related processes placed Afghanistan at the center of the projects without paying due consideration to the interests of Central Asian states. And I think it's true, I think there's a reason we did that, but I don't think that we paid enough heed to what their interests might be. And then a point, perhaps debatable, and again, these are mine, these are from our researcher. Skepticism on the New Silk Road strategy notwithstanding, many Central Asians would prefer to succeed over China's Silk Road economy belt strategy. This preference is driven by concerns over their country's independence, a desire to see their economies driven by market economy mechanisms and become integrated into the global economy. I have some doubts about this, and from what the first panel this morning, I have even more doubts about it. I thought Alex's point about these countries and this region being integrated in the world economy, but in ways that are maybe not so transparent, but the benefit elites, I wonder if those elites would want to shift from those very beneficial relationships and arrangements into something which is, governed by international norms and so forth. So, I guess two concluding points. One, obviously it's not the case that there has been no progress, but as I mentioned, even the transmission of electricity last month was halted by the Taliban blowing up pylons in Baghlan province. So even this kind of progress is extremely vulnerable. The final point is that while we continue to discuss this idea, and while nothing has really happened, a lot has happened around. So you had a lot of the infrastructure we heard about going east-west across the north of Afghanistan. We have the discussions of the China-Pakistan economic corridor that would go northeast, southwest. You have now the reinvestment of India in the transit corridor that goes from the Iranian coast up to Central Asia. So what's happening, and by the way, infrastructure is built extremely quickly now. These projects are happening with new technologies, they're happening very quickly. So what you're having is a kind of band around Afghanistan of infrastructure and possibly trade, which is exactly the opposite of the New Silk Road strategy. But my fear is that this will be the new reality. And before the Afghans can get their own house in order, and before we can sort of convince anybody else that this Silk Road strategy is a good idea, it will be too late. And Afghans will have lost a huge historical opportunity. And I think that's frankly the direction that we're headed. Not to be too. I know we're supposed to be optimistic, but
don't sugarcoat it.
That's not my
really
specialty.